What does Africa's city brand and investment profiles tell us about its urban future? Peter Griffiths is a global urban futures expert who helps people see and imagine cities differently. In this masterclass on city branding, we dive into why brand is so critically important and how to leverage it for maximum impact, the correlation between city mentions and GDP, how brand impacts people's lives, how Paris and London partner to increase footfall by 10%, African cities to be treated as peers internationally, and so much more. Peter, welcome. It's great to have you on the show. Can you give us a bit of background on yourself and your interest in cities?
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you on your really important podcast. I think like you, I am South African. So I spent the first 30 years of my life in South Africa. And I think South Africa is the reason that I'm interested in cities at the most basic point, because what South Africa shows you is you can really mess cities up. And if you can mess them up, you should be able to make them amazing. And so in some ways, many of my thoughts started in South Africa. Well, let's see if we can fix this, if we can get somewhere that's more productive, where people can live better together. But I think from that in South Africa, I looked at being a planner, I looked at being an architect, I looked at being an engineer, and none of that felt quite right. I wasn't so much interested in the technical aspects of city building. I was interested in how it all came together at this big, complex and messy system. And so I did the next best thing. I became a journalist, which was just an opportunity to go to places where maybe many of my friends weren't able to go to in South Africa. I had a free pass to pretty much go everywhere in the country. And that really gave me a freedom to access cities in South Africa and to get a sense of what are they about and what could they be for. So I think kind of that's the early backstory, is just that every time I traveled somewhere else, I thought, why is it that people have put their places together in this way? And what does it tell me about them? And that also sparked a kind of curiosity with culture and history and people and decision-making and actually the huge amount of choice we have about how we live together.
Cities have a lot of challenges to consider. Why should we look at brand when cities already have so many other challenges to solve?
You're right. Cities have an enormous amount of things to solve, and particularly a South African city, but actually any city anywhere in the world has lots of problems to solve. But I think what makes brand particularly interesting is that it makes it easier for problems not to be at the foreground for some cities. So if you think about London, you're not going to be thinking about rubbish collection, maybe in the way that you might think about it in Johannesburg or Cape Town, but it's got the same problem. So why is it that a city like London can somehow not get in the news for bin collection, whereas Cape Town and Johannesburg will? And I think what we need to realize is every time a city is spoken about, that's an opportunity to convey a message about what that place is about. Maybe another example about bins closer to where I live now in the UK is I did some work with Glasgow ahead of COP26, trying to establish legacy around one of the world's most important conferences on climate change. And their bins was what got most of the media attention. It was incredibly difficult to get the city to shift from talking about bins to actually how we're going to live long-term sustainably in a sustainable way. And that some of that comes down to brand and a city's ability to project itself as more than what people might see in a particular moment in time. So that might seem like something which is, quite flimsy. If you have, let's say, issues around equality, you have issues around housing shortages, or actually issues around investment, which, to be fair, these are problems that all cities in the world face, to some way or another. But it seems that when brand works well for a city, it creates an opportunity for the city to deal with challenges in a much more progressive way, and in a way that doesn't overcome everything that the city's trying to do from a narrative point of view.
Peter, is there any science or data to show or to prove that brand really matters for cities?
Yeah, I think, Dan, it is always good to have some kind of evidence or proof for saying that brand matters. And I think I'd like to bring up a study that I did a few years ago looking at the impact of digital mentions on cities as brand. And by digital mentions, I mean the number of social media mentions a city gets, the number of mentions it gets on online news and forums. And this was a global study, so it did it across a basket of languages, making up roughly 90% of global mentions on cities, did it at a global scale, really wanted to get a sense of, what is a place's global footprint, and made sure that things like geography, so we didn't want all the mentions to be concentrated in one place, but also language. So, for example, let's say all of the mentions are in New York and they're all English. Well, actually, that wouldn't be a global footprint. So, let's make sure that we're getting a global footprint of mentions. Um, and we found something really interesting is that when we rank the cities, the top 250 cities around the world by the number of mentions, and we rank the top 250 cities around the world by GDP, the lists were almost the same. And so we've got a very clear correlation between the two. And yes, there is a little bit of a chicken and egg situation as to what is the direction of travel here. And I can talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I think at a very basic sense, if people aren't talking about a place, and it doesn't really matter whether it's good or bad, if they're not talking about your place, you're not going to attract as much investment as a place where people are talking more about it. So that's particularly interesting. I would give some caveats here. So one is people will always say, or a lot of the feedback I've gotten is, but what about when there's a tragedy in a city and people are just talking about the tragedy? I think what's really helpful about looking at this data at a global scale is almost every city around the world will have a kind of a tragedy spike every 12 to 18 months. It's very normal for that to happen within a city context. And it's not to say you want these things to happen to cities, but that there's a pattern where, almost every city around the world will interact with that. What matters here is if the city is important enough, there will be a continued conversation around the city. If the city is not seen as important, the conversation will drop off very quickly. And so it's not necessarily the spike that matters so much as the fact that if it's sustained, it tells you that people see that place as important, and that becomes a proxy for relevance. So in some ways, people talking about your city, they're going to talk about it if it's seen as relevant. They're not if they won't. That's a really important part for brand. I would say the other side is, well, does this lead to long-term change? So I did some work in Helsinki about 4 years ago now, where actually something really interesting happened is that they did a year-long campaign around launching 2 new iconic architectural and cultural sites in the city. They also had the Trump Putin Summit. And when tracking their kind of digital visibility, so the number of mentions they got over a number of years, it went up drastically in this year, and then dropped down again back to normal levels. But what happened after that is that its global city rankings actually went up and sustained some of that level. And so you can very clearly see that the city benefited from at least a short-term boost in people's perceptions of it as a city that you should do business, or you should travel to, or you should invest in, or you should be in just because it's interesting. And so it does seem that in a very tangible sense, if people are talking about place and there are campaigns designed to achieve that, a city will have at least a short-term benefit from that.
And how exactly does brand impact on people's lives?
At a very basic level, people, and by people, I mean the people living in the city itself and people outside the city, are less likely to invest in a place that isn't as visible. And so from that point of view, if I think, let's say a city like Cape Town, if people are really proud of the city, actually the people who live in the city are going to do their best to make sure that the city is great in some way or other. They become kind of the best ambassadors for the city. And the reason I'm using Cape Town is not to pick on it. It's just that I know that you happen to live outside this wonderful city. And it's a city that's in my history too. So I know it fairly well. I think that the challenge then is if people don't feel that there's a purpose in investing in a city, if the sense is generally negative, or there's just a sense that there's no purpose or there's no meaning, actually, you're not going to have the resources to change the city in any way. Forget about whether that change is positive or not. You're not going to be able to get out of the starting blocks. And so at a very basic point, brand does play a role in helping people have a sense of what's possible and maybe even resourcing some of that possibility. And so I would say that in some ways, brand does seem intangible. I mean, there are lots of agencies out there that will try and measure your brand in some way or other. I think I'd always be a little cautious of that. But at a very basic, almost primal sense, if people don't feel connected to place, and a big part of that is brand, they're not going to think about the possibility of it being something more. And in a context like South Africa, where there's just so much opportunity, where you've got large populations that maybe aren't benefiting as much from cities as they should, we very much want to have brand as something that can lead us towards, if not hope, at least a more positive set of choices as to how we can develop a city and manage it.
The South African Cities Network recently brought out a city branding toolkit with various modules. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think maybe as a starting point, it's really worth applauding the South African Cities Network for flagging this as something that's important and for trying to enable cities to start thinking through brand in a productive way. So I think very much using a network of cities as a way of achieving a positive outcome, yeah, it's very much something that I would support in every way possible. And generally, when cities work together in a country, you have a better result. So if anything, that there's a network benefit to brand that's worth exploring as maybe a separate topic. But I think I do have a few areas where I would suggest the toolkit could go a little bit further. And this is going to be hard because only some cities will be resourced in order to do this. So you've got to be pragmatic. What is the capacity of a city to really tell its own story? But I would say there are a few things that I would consider. The one is, should a city really have one story? So I think a lot of toolkits out there will try and get you to distill what is your one key message, what is your one key brand proposition. And cities aren't organizations, and we shouldn't treat them like organizations. They are far too complex for that. They've got far too many conflicting interests. And some of those conflicting interests are actually quite productive to what it makes the city interesting. So they're not something we should be scared of. Um, and so I would be cautious of any roadmap that suggests you can have one story. I think what's far more valuable is how can you have a series of stories or a series of circumstances or contexts or images that all work together to provide entry points into a place. And by entry points, it's, I'm an investor. Oh, I see a photo of Cape Town. I think actually it'd be quite nice to go visit and see what it's about. Or I am a student and I live in Johannesburg and I think, well, it would be nice to have some sea around me. I've got several cities to choose from. Which one am I going to choose? Which story or image or relationship is going to connect me positively to a place or make me feel like I can get there? And I think we need to realize this could be in South Africa or internationally. So there is some competition here where it comes to this aspect. Um, and so, and then again, markets are also quite complex. You're accessing people from not just South Africa, not just Africa, but from around the world, potentially, if you're thinking of a South African city. And so what are the range of stories or approaches or realities that matter to people or that can make people feel like, oh, it's possible for me to go there. And so maybe let's think about London. Like I had no reason to travel to London, except that in a lot of information that I saw, it was a city that I could get to, which is a city that seemed possible, even though you know, let's be honest, London is a big, scary city in a lot of ways for somebody who grew up in a small town in South Africa. But somehow it seemed accessible. It's like, I can go there. Uh, Thinking back, the only reason is the large amount of stories and information that I was handed on the city. It felt very familiar to me. The same is true about New York, walking around Times Square, feeling a sense of, oh, I'm kind of part of the story. Why is that? Oh, I've seen this shot in hundreds of movies. I've been bred a certain familiarity over time. And there, what's really interesting is New York City wasn't necessarily controlling that narrative. This was being peddled by a third party in Hollywood movies. So something really interesting as to where do those entry points come from? And then I'd say the second, but leading on to that is content. And so if I think about this toolkit, it stresses marketing and it stresses communications, which are both really important. But it doesn't really talk about content as a kind of infrastructure. And again, if you think you can get on a plane, it takes you somewhere. If you get on a train, it takes you somewhere. That's all infrastructure that can connect you to place. Content can work in very much the same way. And so I think the big question, especially for some of the smaller cities in South Africa, is what kind of content infrastructure do they need for people to not only know that they exist, but to get a sense that they could travel there or they could be meaningfully connected to those places.
Cities and towns do currently promote themselves. What can they be doing more of, and how should they be thinking more strategically about this?
I think it's a really interesting question mark because no place is going to want to not say something good about itself, and that's in some ways the essence of promotion. You should be paying attention to us. We're great. Come on. Um, but I think we also need to realize that there are thousands of cities around the world that are actually quite similar. They have similar populations, they have similar challenges. Um, so I think for me, the thing that I would be asking is maybe a range of questions. So the one might be, if I'm a small town, is the natural connection point into my place a direct entry point or via maybe a larger neighboring center? And so what, if you are, let's say you live in a small part, like, let's say within 100 kilometers of Cape Town, there are lots and lots of small places that are all kind of on the wider tourism network of, these are places that are great to travel to. They're beautiful. Um, but on their own, they're not an entry point. Cape Town is. And so the question mark is, well, how do these regions or places illustrate themselves in a way that they're connected to Cape Town? Maybe taking a step back, let's use two really big cities around the world that everybody knows, Paris and London. Paris and London did a joint campaign a few years ago with the Eurostar, targeting North American travelers, and they increased their footfall and travelers by 10%. That's super interesting. That you can have two of the world's most visible cities globally from a brand point of view working together to increase attraction. So I would say that the same holds true for smaller places. How do they connect to the main entry point? And often that can be quite difficult to do because there are some governance tensions there. There are some political tensions. And I would say the UK is a good example of really struggling with this. There are lots of small places in the UK that people don't know about because they're not willing to work with their neighbors. Where instead of having an urban entry point of maybe 2 or 3 million people, you have 10 of 200 or 300,000 people. And it's quite difficult to scale that. And so I would say, where do you draw your kind of functional boundaries from a promotion point of view would be where I'd start. Maybe as an entry point for South African cities. And then I would also pay attention to how people are talking about you internationally. So I did some work for Manchester a few years ago, and I think Manchester has spent lots of money targeting China as a a trade and a transport and a connecting route, and spent a lot of money on that. And if you look at the conversations happening in China, Manchester doesn't really pop up on the map, as relevant. And so I would question, what is the legacy benefit of several decades of investing in brand in China? And should they maybe have targeted one city, or instead of the whole of China? What is that? So I would definitely try and look at data from not the South African perspective, but from a global perspective and say, is my place really relevant internationally? And it might be that it's not, and that's okay, because some smaller places offer better quality of life in many ways. So, so they're not necessarily, they're places we should have. And it might be being globally relevant just isn't that important for a place doing well. And so that's a good question to ask too.
Peter, in general, what impact has the pandemic had on the way cities brand themselves and how they can stay relevant, given forms of competition that is rising to draw people out of cities?
Yeah, I think COVID, it's difficult to have a global perspective on its impact on places and cities. But I would say there are probably a few things which are maybe unusual, is that you had a situation where, or a global event where, in a sense, the pause button was pushed on cities everywhere in the world. And they've all kind of come out of the starting blocks at the same time. You could say, some places were a year delayed, but if you think about, over 100 years, the starting block is pretty much the same time. We don't normally have these circumstances where cities around the world can all reboot together. So I think that's quite interesting. And creates a unique opportunity for places to actually own a bit of their story and their narrative. And I would say that some cities that did it well used the downtime to really rethink the range of images that people would see about their place when they started traveling there again or commuting there for work. So that's probably something to think about. I would say the other thing that's interesting is that it's cities have maybe over the last 40 years or so had to work really hard to become meaningful again. So in many parts of the world, people were abandoning cities. They were like, we're not so interested in these places, moving to the countryside. And cities have worked really hard over the last few decades to be meaningful in terms of the global policy agenda. So if you think about climate change, cities have really only recently become seen as the solution to climate change in some conversations. If you think about challenges around productivity and innovation and skills and solving, future global challenges, cities have really put themselves on the mark there. And if you think about cultural flows, cities have also done really well to say we're the places where you can know just about anything about what's happening around the world. So cities have done incredibly well in a short space of time to make themselves relevant again. But you're right. There are lots of people moving to the countryside. So myself and my family, I'm now living not in central London anymore. I'm now living close to the beach. And there's an interesting question mark as to what does that mean for cities and what does it mean for their capacity to generate talent? And actually, what does it mean for me as somebody who studies cities and looks at them and tries to think about what is their purpose? Like, have I sold out in some ways? And I think the flip side to that question is the more interesting one is what is the new competition that cities are going to face? So, how are they going to stay attractive to labor forces? How are they going to attract skills? What happens if investment is more disaggregated across wider geographies? What are the opportunities with that? Because actually there may be some really interesting opportunities for cities. They may well be more attractive longer term. And so I think actually that I wouldn't focus so much on COVID as an event as itself, because I think that can lead to many questions about what governments did right and what they did wrong. I would look at it much more from what is the impact going to have on how people arrange themselves, and what they're able to consume, and what impact will that then have on how people see place. And maybe a practical example is transport infrastructure. So if I'm not so when I was still in London, instead of traveling into work 5 days a week, I was traveling into work 2 or 3 days a week. That freed up at least 5 or 6 hours a week for me to do something else. To either consume transport in a different way, a bicycle or a scooter, or potentially to go in 6 hours to think about solving a problem that maybe I couldn't solve before, or just 6 hours to spend with friends. So if I'm spending those 6 hours with friends, then maybe there need to be amenities to support that. And so I would look at COVID much more from what impact does it have on restructuring consumption in cities too? And how does that mean brand needs to reconfigure itself? And what are the pushes and pulls getting people into place?
What can African cities learn from other parts of the world? Are there any cities getting it right that is relevant in the African context?
Yeah. And I think it's a really important question to ask what African cities can learn from the rest of the world. But I think it's also worth foreshadowing just the name of your podcast, Future Cities Africa. That African cities have a future. And if they have a future, the question is, how do they get there? And so maybe the biggest thing that African cities can learn from the rest of the world is that cities outside of Africa are projecting themselves as solutions to problems and places where things can happen. And I would suggest that African cities might want to get on and start doing the same. You've got huge populations, often quite young. Some really interesting things happening in African cities. Why don't I know about them? And again, this links a little bit back to the conversation we had about brand. But I spent some time in quite a few African cities over a 2-year project looking at, the same question you have. What is the future of African cities? And I was really fascinated by how livable a city like Lagos felt, or um, how many smart people were solving problems in Nairobi. And that's not to say that those cities don't have challenges. Of course they do. Um, but I kind of want to get beyond the challenges, and I want to get beyond the sense of why is it that African cities should just be learning from the rest of the world, when if we think about, let's say, sustainability, in some cities in Africa, 60 to 70% of people walk or cycle. No European city can say that they have that sustainability footprint. And you might say, well, there's some equality issues and there's some bigger challenges that we need to deal with. But, in some ways, South African cities or African cities may well have a lot more of the answers than we give them credit for. And so that would probably be the first step is for African cities to start saying, there are these big global challenges. Which of these are we going to own and take forward? But if you want the practical side of that question, Daniel, I would say, don't look at the really big cities. Look at the smaller ones and see how they have changed their profiles. So, if I'm thinking about Europe, a city like Helsinki, which not that long ago merged its brand and inward investment teams, have a look at that as a case study as to why they did that, why they brought brand and investment closer together. I think it's a good move. Have a look at a city like Rotterdam, which from a European perspective doesn't have the most European interest or architecture because a lot of it was destroyed in the world wars, but has done a really interesting job of reshaping its images around modern architecture and culture. So look at how cities have taken something which seems to be something that's a weakness and turned it into a strength. That's something really interesting in that dynamic. I mean, I would look at cities like, I know Dubai is a bigger city, but I'd look at the cities that have tried to build themselves into brand and ask questions about, what is the long-term consequence of that approach? And is it something that African cities should replicate? Some have tried. I would suggest it is a very expensive approach to take. And actually, I think just paying it forward, is it likely to have a result in an African context, or should African cities own slightly different solutions and options for moving forward? So again, I think it comes from African cities can learn from the rest of the world, but I don't think that should get in the way of them presenting something that is unique. And, I felt like Black Panther is super interesting. And I was really keen to see the counter narrative of Africa leading the way in future technology. And, but I was really disappointed that from an urban point of view, there was no imagery really to show like, what does this futuristic African city look like? And it might be very simple, but it was really an opportunity missed to show that Africa can control or own some kind of an urban future where people can live well together from a cultural or technological or some kind of advanced sense. And Africa has the history of that. It's not necessarily outside of the history of some of the settlements that it's built over the last few millennia. So I would say find the opportunities to show why Africa is able to do it differently and possibly better in context.
Peter, do you have any advice for cities that want to elevate their brand for more impact?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to stress again that cities are really complex systems. So the top tip is not to trust anybody who says this one thing will fix your city. If anybody says that to you, really consider whether you should find another advisor. And now I'm going to tell you one thing to do. So, you can decide whether you trust me or not. But something that I think is worth doing is thinking about how people are going to access your city if they learn about it for the first time. The first thing that people might do if they haven't heard about your place or your city is they'll Google it and they'll have a look at Google Images. So just as a very easy exercise to get a sense of how people might see your place without having any real information about it is do a Google image search of your place and look at the top 20 Google image search results. So kind of look at the pictures that come up above the fold in a sense. And ask yourself a few questions. So does it show your city? So if you did this for London, you'd see 20 images of London and you'd be able to recognize them as London. Then do they show a diverse range of experiences in your city? So 20 photos of Cape Town that all show Table Mountain. not so helpful. You'd want to make sure that actually there's a diverse range of entry points to a place. And maybe another example of this is Barcelona. So if you Google Barcelona and you see a whole lot of people running around in red shirts, not actually that helpful for the city's brand, not diverse enough. What I'd say is if the answer is no to any of these, design your campaigns to target this. See how you can fix this. And maybe a very simple tip is to start tagging these iconic images or the image sources in a range of different languages. So don't just tag them in English. English is 40% of the internet conversation around cities, but start thinking about Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, French, and Arabic. And Arabic, even though it's a slightly smaller market, actually it's hugely strategic because there's not that much quality content on cities in Arabic. So it's actually a fairly easy win. Then I would start thinking about, well, what are some of the other places that people would access knowledge on the city? So things like Wiki Travel, TripAdvisor, and start getting a sense of how many entry points there are to your place. And then beyond that, does your city need local knowledge to get around? So for example, if I'm used to traveling on public transport, I'm a solo traveler and I land in Cape Town, how do I take a minibus taxi? So I can't tell you the amount of times in South African cities I've tried to take a municipal bus and found it just too hard to figure out the scheduling, figure out how to use it. And I'm not talking my city. I'm not talking BRT, which from a communication point of view is quite accessible. I'm talking actually how do people access the more granular transport options that are available in a place, and especially outside cities which don't have flagship transport infrastructure or don't have train networks or bus networks that are mapped. So that's maybe a starting tip that I would suggest every city starts thinking about is how are they likely to be seen from the outside? People get to know about them for the first time.
And in closing, what is your vision for the future of cities? What would you like to see happen?
Yeah, so Daniel, I think that the vision of African cities is maybe the starting point is just that they're much more visible. I think that that's maybe even the starting point. So if I think about global city rankings, African cities almost never feature, unless you start going down below 500 or even 1,000. And that's not to say that African cities aren't good enough to be on global city rankings. I think it's really important that we realize that global city rankings are a perspective. It's just that people don't think that they're relevant. So I would see my vision for African cities as one where people see them as relevant when it comes to whatever problem is people are trying to solve, that they would think, actually, let me consider an African city in the basket of solutions that I'm looking at. And I would say there are probably two things that follow on from that. So the vision is where African cities can be treated as peers. So again, if I did some work looking at a bunch of African cities, and just because they both start with L, Lagos and London, they both big cities, they're both facing many similar challenges, actually, in terms of how they house and govern large populations. But it's very difficult for London to learn from Lagos, but somehow it's easy for Lagos to learn from London. So, from a peer point of view, I think the world is at a disadvantage in its inability to learn from African cities. And that's something which I would want to see change in the future. And then I'd also want to see some of Africa's assets working much more gainfully for the cities that they are hosted in. So if I think about Cape Town, it's got Africa's biggest diversified media company. But if I look at the data on Cape Town's ability to tell its own story, more people are talking about Cape Town outside of Cape Town than inside Cape Town. Now, that's a massive missed opportunity. If you think about the infrastructure that Cape Town has at its disposal, forget about the beauty of the environment or the people in the city, some of the institutional capacity within the city to really make it thrive is not being used in maybe the most effective way. So that there's something interesting there is how do African cities ensure that some of the infrastructure that exists within them is working together to ensure a future where people can thrive in that city. And then I would probably take the scale back. And this is not just for African cities, but I'd say that my vision for cities as a whole is that they can create spaces where all people can live meaningfully together. And I think in many ways, African cities have a lot of the building blocks for showing us how to do that. And so again, there's this question mark: is how do we not just extract resources, which is generally the approach to African cities? How do we actually move towards sharing ideas in a way that's productive and gainful for the whole world?
A big thank you to Peter Griffiths for this insightful conversation on why city branding matters here on Future Cities Africa.